Hello, welcome to the latest edition of the SportsPro podcast. I am your host, Tom Bassam. This week, it's another two-man job. It's me and Ed Dixon, our deputy editor. Ed, hello, how are you?
I'm good, thanks, mate. Yeah, we're gone with two up top again. We've stacked
two up top, none in defence. It's very much the Fabian Herzler style, Robert De Zerbi influenced, all-out guns blazing on this week's pod. And the reason I'm starting with football metaphors is because the Premier League is back. It is so back. And we are here to talk all about it. We're not talking about the matches, of course. We're talking about straight business. I feel like I'm in the company of a man who knows a fair amount about this. You've got a piece coming up, Ed. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so it's just kind of looking at the sort of the key questions ahead of kickoff, really. Probably be a lot easier just to focus on all the transfer gossip, the new managerial hires. But there have been quite a lot of things bubbling away in the background, really, at a time when, clubs are increasingly sort of under scrutiny over how they conduct business. There's a lot at stake here. So the piece just kind of looks at what those big questions are, kind of the state of play of them and what the ramifications may be.
Yes, Ed's piece is available right now on the .com. It came out yesterday. It is currently for SportsPro Plus subscribers only. SportsPro Plus, of course, is our subscription offering. Lucky you, listener, you do get access to a discounted version of that, should you want to. All you have to do is buy an annual subscription for SportsPro Plus and use code podcast10 at checkout, and that will give you access to not just Ed's piece, but a whole host of other great pieces of content, including our commercial guides, of which the Premier League is highly featured currently, our other insights and analysis pieces, our media hub, our wire service, our deal trackers across media and sponsorship sectors. And as I said, right now, available for podcast listeners, you can get a 10% off using code podcast10 at checkout. That applies to an annual subscription only, and terms and conditions apply, obviously. Right, I'm going to jump straight into it. What's more likely? These are riffs on kind of ongoing stories with the Premier League right now. So the first one, what is more likely? Everton get bought by November, or Manchester City get a double-digit points deduction before the end of the season?
I think Everton can't afford to wait much longer to find a new buyer. And looking at sort of the situation the club has been in, well, for the last couple of years, really, but it's all kind of come to a head, really, after the 777 Partners deal fell through. Freaking Group came in, that fell through as well. John Textor looks like he's tabled a bid, but again, for that to go through, he'd have to sell his Crystal Palace stake. So it just adds to the complications. But reading sort of the rap sheet on Everton, it makes for pretty grim reading. It's run up 6 consecutive years of losses, reportedly owes north of £500 million to third-party creditors. There's also been reports of another points deduction. And then, of course, they've got, their £750 million stadium, which is still being built and is at risk of rapidly becoming a millstone around their neck. So, yeah, I think Everton, they need a deal done sooner rather than later. And that might mean that it sort of expedites the finding of a new buyer. Just on City, we've heard reports that the case might be brought forward. The hearing date might be brought forward to next month. That doesn't necessarily mean we'll get a verdict. And I think even if we do get a verdict before the end of the year, I would be staggered if anything stronger than maybe a couple of points is handed to City. It's kind of a difficult one for the Premier League. They want to show that, especially with the regulator looming, they want to show that they're capable of keeping their own house in order. But at the same time, it's not really in their interest to slap the Premier League champions with a huge points deduction, or even something more extreme than that, like even something like relegation. So, yeah, I would say the Everton one is more pressing and more likely. But the City case, we're expecting to start in the next month or so. But I think that will, as it already has for 18 months now, that is just going to rumble on a little bit longer.
The reason I posed the question in this way was to kind of bring up a few different points, and you've hit on most of them actually, Ed, so thank you for that.
Goodbye, everyone.
The Everton thing is, I mean, as you sort of laid out, it's not the most attractive proposition right now as a club. Do you want to buy this heavily debt-laden asset where you're going to not really be able to sort of see the fruits of the labour of the stadium build for a few seasons? Because one, that cost a lot to pay off, as we saw with Arsenal around the sort of turn of the last but one decade. And also, it's just been terribly managed for a few years. So you're buying something that is going to be a long-term project. It makes it difficult. John Textor as well, as you said, currently invested in Crystal Palace, will have to sell that before he is able to buy, which makes me kind of think like this could drag on. We saw one takeover with 777, as you mentioned, drag on even further last year than many was predicted before it collapsed, which I think many of us did predict as well. There's just a lot there, isn't there? And with Man City, I'm surprised you think it's such a small points deduction that's coming their way, Ed. 115 charges, sort of the nature of some of those. I mean, I know they're paying their QC more than they pay Kevin De Bruyne, but I still think that there's a bigger case to answer for there. As for which is more likely, I do think an Everton takeover is more likely. Like someone will emerge from the bushes and buy it. But what makes you think it's going to be such a low points deduction aside from the optics you mentioned?
Yeah, it's 150 charges, but if you read between the lines, it essentially sort of boils down to sort of inflating income, deflating costs, and non-cooperation. So the 100 plus charges thing makes for good copy, but it's kind of three main things that they're being charged with, if you like. I don't want to call it a hunch because that's not particularly informed, but we've seen that City has got form in the past with overturning decisions like this. We saw it happen in CAS on appeal with UEFA. I think what's happening with City is like the relations with the Premier League have been strained, but they've become more and more strained as this process has gone on, because the City they've already begun legal action against the Premier League to try and strike down its sponsorship rules around associated party transaction, which was essentially brought in by the league, sort of aimed at the richer clubs who signed sponsorship deals with companies that have links to their own owners. So City have argued that unfairly kind of stifles their on-pitch success, given how closely entwined the Etihad Airways is with the club and the links Etihad has with the City ownership. I just think there are so many legal plates spinning here that I feel a compromise of sorts will be reached, where the Premier League is able to save face and say that we've given them this unprecedented points deduction. I said 3 at the start, 3 points. I think it could be as low as that, but I don't think realistically it probably looks like it'll be more. They might sort of slap them with a points deduction that they will spin as kind of the highest of its kind, that sort of first of its kind of partnership, keeps City in the league. Because if City go down, the whole process is going to have to start again, because City will appeal that decision. So it creates even more uncertainty. The Premier League doesn't want that. And then if City get that on appeal, then it weakens the Premier League's hand even further. And I just don't think that's what they want. They want to be able to show that they've taken action that is sort of good for them, but ultimately will keep a club in the Big Six on side. That's how I think it's going down. It may age like milk, this take.
No, I think it's a very rational take, Ed. It's probably a bit more rational than mine. I think they may do something which it will look like a fudge, because it is a fudge. And it'll be something like they'll dock them 3 points for each of the seasons that were impacted or covered by this stuff. You top them up over the course of it. It's like, we've given City a 15-point deduction, but actually it amounts to like 3 points a season and doesn't actually change the award of the title in any of those years. It'll be something like that, I think. You're right. Like City are they're in that kind of 2008 financial crisis, too big to fail mold, I think, at this point.
We've already established this is a bit of a legal minefield. There's so many intricacies and complexities here, but I sort of wonder if there'll be like sort of suspended partnerships or like a multi-tiered, a multifaceted kind of punishment. Like some things will be suspended. So if you're uncooperative with your finances, again, we'll ban you from making any player transfers for 2 years, for example. So I think there might be a lot of conditions. There might be like a flat punishment, which on the surface looks quite tame. But I think there'll be all these caveats and sort of additions to it, which again, the Premier League can kind of spin to their advantage whilst not under threat of more legal challenges from City. Because that's ultimately what they want. When the case is settled, that they can draw a line under it. And I think if they go too hard, which many people might praise them for, I think they, unfortunately, such is the might of City, the league might be creating more problems for themselves.
We can revisit this at the end of the season and ask who is more effective, Erling Haaland or Lord Panic. For our second, what's more likely, the Football Governance Bill, which is the new piece of legislation which was announced by the previous government but not delivered in time before the election. But the Labour Party have committed to seeing through and even strengthening, will get passed before Christmas, or an overseas game is announced before we have a league champion, which will probably be in May.
I'd say the Football Governance Bill here. It's had cross-party support. As you said, Labour's made clear that they intend to revisit it. I should say they put forward a couple of amendments, but Keir Starmer said he doesn't want to hold things up. So this bill is inevitable.
Much like Thanos.
Yes, one for the Marvel fans out there. The overseas game, I think it's felt closer than it has in recent years. This concept, I think, was first sort of seriously mooted, what was it? I think 2008, Game 39 it was called. I mean, that got shot down and that's been revisited. I think the difference with the overseas game here, though, is that the Premier League is making significantly more money from overseas broadcasters, particularly from the US, with NBC, which is paying $2.7 billion for its 6-year deal until 2028. There were some quite interesting quotes from NBC. Was it John Miller, senior exec at NBC Sports, who admitted he'd love to see a couple of Premier League games in the States, potentially to open the season, kind of like a curtain raiser. I guess sort of similar to what the NRL is now doing in Las Vegas. The difference is Premier League is, it's in a different stratosphere commercially compared to the NRL. But pushback already, from the FSA, they attacked the Game 39 concept 16 years ago, and they've done it again. I think it's getting a little bit more traction between clubs, particularly those with American owners. Liverpool chairman Tom Werner, for example. It's kind of weird, the Premier League's success. When you consider sort of how it began, no one could have predicted it would be this commercial juggernaut it is now. But this global success, it's essentially kind of a double-edged sword. It's brought these record broadcast deals. Fans want to see their favourite teams. Overseas fans rather want to see their favourite teams in action. But domestic fans are going to feel more alienated. And if there is an international game, it would add to an already bloated calendar. So I think the Premier League is going to kick that one down the road for a bit longer. And Richard Masters, the Premier League CEO, he said it's not in our immediate plans. He said the door's ajar, but it's not something they're looking to do in the immediacy. So I think they might revisit it, but it has to make sense for a number of different reasons and for a number of different stakeholders. Whereas the Football Governance Bill, which would see the introduction of an independent regulator, it's a question of when rather than if that comes in. It hasn't been brought forward yet in terms of being presented. But as you say, Keir Starmer has said, we don't want to hold it up. We just want to tweak it slightly. So that still needs to be done. But it's got cross-party support. It's so far along the process now. That is coming, as you say, once it's brought forward, when it's enshrined into law and when it actually takes up its proper powers. That may not be this season, but I still think that's more likely to come than an overseas game.
At risk of this podcast becoming quite dull, I'm going to have to agree with you. The overseas game thing, I think, is where the sort of shifting ownership of the clubs in the Premier League, because ultimately that's who we're talking about, right? When we say the Premier League is owned by its clubs, they are the shareholders. Folk like Richard Masters do their bidding. But yeah, the ownership of the Premier League is now so international, and that's its focus. It knows that's its strength too, actually. So one of the things in the latest Premier League commercial guide, which we'll talk a little bit later in this show, but one of the kind of interesting things that you can sort of get from that is some data around the percentage of Premier League fans are in the world, which illustrates its global popularity. The Premier League is the most popular sports league in places like Indonesia and South Africa. It's more popular than domestic properties, which is extremely rare. Like, that is not something that happens in a lot of markets, and it's almost unique. The NBA is one of those properties, and the Champions League to a sort of lesser extent because it's an international, if regional, property. But the Premier League as a sort of just a strictly English product is incredibly popular in overseas markets. So taking it elsewhere, sadly for fans, because I think they are the ones that ultimately lose out here, that is inevitable. The 39th game, I don't know how they would make that work from a competitive standpoint. I don't know if that will get revisited, but I could see a fixture being taken abroad. Maybe the answer here is kind of more obvious, and it's something like the Community Shield or whatever it's called these days. Plenty of countries have taken that game abroad, given that it will always feature the league champions and it will always feature another big club who's won the FA Cup the season before. It's probably got a fair amount of appeal, would have that curtain-raising sensibility. The only issue is that game is rights managed by the FA, not the Premier League. So you'd have to kind of get around that. How you do that, I don't know. But that to me is the obvious answer, which game does this. But I don't see that happening by the end of the season for sure. It's just one of those things that I think, given the FIFA's kind of changing stance on this and the league's real drive to try and take a game to America, like that seems like the direction of travel with.
No, I think you're right. The Community Shield concept, because it is just a glorified friendly, unless you're David Moyes, because he won a trophy in his first competitive game at United.
Or Jose Mourinho.
Quite, indeed. The complications with the FA would make that difficult. But again, you'd think a sort of compromise of sorts could be reached if the money's there to go to the relevant parties. But we've seen in pre-season, like, organisers, when they go overseas, they've really tried to big up these overseas pre-season games. You know, they've given them an official title to try and increase its prestige, if you like, to sort of satisfy the market that it's going to. If someone like a La Liga goes overseas for a game, that might almost force the Premier League's hand, because what they like being the best and they like being first. And if another league like a La Liga does that, that might change their attitude slightly.
I don't know if I agree with that necessarily. I don't necessarily think they like being first. I think they like being right. They might even look at La Liga, wait for them and look at the pitfalls and try and learn from that before they do it themselves. I don't think that necessarily the Premier League always wants to be a first mover. If it was, he could have done stuff like, I don't know, launch its own direct-to-consumer channel in foreign countries. It still hasn't done that. Lots of leagues have done it and it still hasn't done it. Partly because it doesn't need to, but partly because it just sort of feels like with the Premier League, we don't have to make those kind of moves. It's a bit like the NFL, waiting for the market to choose which is the most popular route to go down and then really going into that and making sure that they have it right. Manchester United did this when they were commercially successful for a very long time too. I guess it's sort of the reserve of the big beast. You get to sort of sit and wait and see what others do before you make your charge. Before we move on, the football governance bill, I do think we'll do it relatively quickly. I think it's an absolute political open goal, really, for the new government. Incredibly popular with voters. Doesn't really cost them anything, which is nice because they don't have any money. And will give some power back to fans. And I think the Premier League are genuinely scared of it because it could redress some of those financial issues that are a long-term and ongoing concern, I think, for the general pyramid in the UK. The general pyramid in the UK is finely balanced. It doesn't quite work as it should in terms of delivering money all the way through. If it did, we wouldn't have seen clubs go bust. But then at the same time, we also are a country of about 60 million people and we support 72 professional football clubs. So like that in itself is pretty remarkable. While you can point to the flaws of the system that we've got, you do have to say that's a lot more successful than other countries where previously this doesn't work. Spain, Italy, France is barely able to run its own league currently. Spain gets semi-professional when you get down to at the third tier. Italy the same. Germany, third tier is only semi-pro, whereas over here, in that country of 60 million people, there's another professional football league north of the border too. So I do think the EFL and the Premier League as an ecosystem is a remarkable feat of perseverance in the face of market forces. And if this football governance bill does something to help maintain and prolong the existence of that, then I think it can only be a good thing.
I was going to say my previous answer saying they like to be first, I meant with certain commercial things, but it's taken 15, 20 minutes before you disagree with me on something, so we'll take that. I would say as well, I wonder if the regulator will have any say on things like overseas games, given its scope. But again, we'll have to see on that one.
Yeah, the regulator will happen. What form it will take will, I think, is still the sliding scale, depending on levels of influence. Right, I said we'd talk about this, so we should. Our new Premier League commercial guide is out. It's been updated. It has a lot of new data in it. It's absolutely fantastic. It's a brilliant resource for anyone working in football, anyone working in sports media, anyone working in sponsorship. It's got a bit of everything, really. Now, Ed, I asked you to prepare for this podcast by picking out a couple of highlights. What's your first?
I should say for listeners, I'm asked to prepare for every pod, even if it may not sound like that. In this instance, I think the one that stood out for me, and we have touched on it in a previous pod, I think over the last month, but it's the sheer number of clubs having front of shirt deals with betting sponsors. It's as things stand, it's 11 Premier League teams with those deals in place. The fact that they're doing deals with betting brands, that's nothing new. The criticism isn't new either. Accusations of greed, things like that. That's nothing new. We know why they're doing this, why these 11 clubs are doing it. And notably, it's not the ones from the so-called Big Six. They're continuing to cash in because of this agreement to outlaw betting sponsorship that's going to come in. That's from the front of matchday shirts, I should say, from the 2026-27 season. So they're trying to get as much out of what has historically been a lucrative category before time runs out. Now, you can't necessarily begrudge a Premier League club that. They provided a reliable source of revenue. Clubs can chase the dream. Fans can maybe stomach having a little-known brand on the front of their shirt if it means they get a few fun nights under the lights. But this season in particular, it feels like it's attracted a lot of scrutiny from the media and supporters. I mean, just to use my club, for example, Southampton, they've done a deal with Rollbit. The official announcement made no mention of the words betting or gambling. For me, that's misleading. Even the company describes itself as a crypto and NFT casino, for example. So the fact that wasn't even mentioned in the official first press release just doesn't sit well. But even beyond that, we're seeing a lot of clubs, they're doing deals with firms that either have a limited presence or are not even available in the UK, the club and the Premier League's home market. So, Crystal Palace's main sponsorship deal with Net8, that company has had to deny reports linking it with overseas websites and claims it offered bets on, cockfighting, which is, I think, illegal.
Not pornographic, I should mention.
Yes, yeah. But anyway, it poses several questions here. Yes, clubs have to satisfy the Premier League's profit and sustainability rules, and they're trying to maximise those revenues. But it raises questions over things like due diligence, around potential commercial partners. And actually, it kind of means that when this ban does come in a couple of years, clubs are going to have to fill this revenue gap, but doing so may be difficult, in terms of getting something of similar value, if not more.
To counter that slightly, what I would say is that the ban on gambling shirt sponsors that comes in, I think it's 2026, 27, right? We're going to have 2 more seasons where clubs can bank on those kind of deals. After that, they can agree sleeve sponsorships, and they can still agree club partnerships, which includes like advertising, branding around the ground, probably still like integrations within the ground itself. So probably like little betting windows, etc. You can't cut out the gambling industry because actually it's not illegal. People will still want to gamble on football. Yes, you should, and it's good to promote sensible gambling, all of that kind of stuff. Fully on board with that messaging. But these clubs still have to retain relationships with these betting brands. Now, whether or not they retain those deals with the dubious ones, which may or may not operate properly in this market, or offer bets on cockfighting, that's something entirely different. But they will have to maintain these kind of relationships with the people that they're currently working with. So there is no point at the moment cutting off those deals completely because, one, as you said, you're cutting off a significant revenue source, you're cutting off potentially future partners, and you're needlessly reducing your budget when you don't have to. Now, that's not the moral argument, and it's also not the kind of argument probably that certain sets of fans want to hear, but it's a kind of undisputable fact currently. I understand the hand-wringing on this because there is a betting ban coming in and people should be like, well, why aren't you going out and pursuing partnerships? This is football. Football is a industry that's professionalizing, but it's not like, we're not talking about the Olympic Games here. This isn't the cleanest brand to align yourself anyway. Think about the people that wear the shirts, buy them. They're also the same people that disgrace themselves in riots around the UK recently too. That's not all football fans. That's some football fans. Another undisputable fact. We're not talking about something with the sanctity here of an Olympics or a World Cup or whatever. It's still the commercial market which has its grey areas. On a personal level, yeah, I agree with you. Like, I think in the long term, it could be short-sighted for these clubs to go after those betting brands because they're the ones that are still offering them the money. But I don't think necessarily right now, with 2 years really to work on finding new sponsors, that getting overly het up about 11 front of shirt sponsors, which is more than half the league, but getting overly het up about that is maybe premature. If we're still talking about this 6 months before the ban comes in, then yes, commercial departments are going to have to pull their finger out.
Yeah, no, that's fair. I think, especially with the gambling white paper as well, that's been, that's sort of circling. But again, the implementation of that sort of seems to be stuck in purgatory slightly. But without wanting to go down a rabbit hole there, I think that with these 11 clubs, and you hear this stuff like, these whistle ban on gambling advertising the front of match day shirts, that's still not addressing the normalization and legitimization of gambling as an issue. And it's not addressing the problem gamblers, I should say, as far as the gambling industry is concerned. A common criticism levied against the gambling industry is that for them, a problem gambler is one who wins. Now, I'm not wanting to take the moral high ground here. I just think from a business standpoint, the impending ban that's coming in is PR fluff, really, because the rest of the inventory is going to remain available. The only thing that's going to really usher in further change is this white paper, and you'd expect the gambling lobbyists to push back on that. But I just think from a business standpoint, I've been to fan forums where my club has done deals with betting brands before, and that question regularly comes up. And it's, this is when my club was in the Premier League. We're a Premier League club, we're an established Premier League club. Is the discrepancy in money really that big? And I can't remember who from the board was speaking at the time. It would have been the CEO or the chief revenue officer or something like that. But he said, yes, we have to strike a balance between a deal that is financially in the best interest of the club, but also aligning with a partner that we think reflects the values of the club. And I'm not saying it's Southampton in this case. I'm not saying Rolbit are not have the same values as Southampton Football Club. But what I'm saying is a lot of these other brands that teams have done new deals with in the off season, for me, if you're not even providing a service in the home market that you're advertising, I don't think that reflects the values of the club that you're sponsoring. But that's not why they do it.
But they also can't tell you the reason why they do it. No one's going to come out and say, we're signing this partnership because Southampton offer us exposure worldwide for our brand, which really isn't that important in the league, but no one else is able to offer us this level of exposure at this price point. No one's going to say that because it doesn't fit with a acceptable narrative for anyone, journalists, fans, whatever. That is the reality of it, right? Like, that's why these deals happen. It's the unspoken truth. And I'm beginning to sound a little bit like Joe Rogan, but
don't do that, mate.
You've got to kind of cut through some of the nonsense on this.
Yeah, I agree.
That is really it. Before we spend another 20 minutes talking about gambling.
Yeah, I was going to say, I've sort of turned this into I'd like to clarify, it's not this. I don't have a vendetta against the gambling industry. I just think with the Premier League's finances under the microscope, perhaps more than they've ever been with the regulator, these kind of deals, for me, I think it's financially they make sense, but beyond that, I don't think they don't make much more sense beyond that. The financial element is ultimately the most important in this league. So, yeah.
You nailed it first time, Ed. I think money talks. Right, more money talking. My commercial guide highlight that I picked out. The Premier League, actually, we're going to stay in the realm of sponsorship and marketing. The Premier League this season has 11 official partners. It's a veritable blue chip list. Lead partner EAFC, official bank Barclays, official beer Guinness, official timekeeper Hublot, official ball Nike, official cloud partner Oracle. And then you get down to the licensees, Avery Dennison, who do the printing, which is thoroughly exciting. Panini, obviously, make the stickers. So Rare, now that's the digital collectibles. Official licensee Football Manager, well, I think that's kind of, everyone knows what Football Manager is. And then Rezzil, they are the VR partner, essentially. They're going to be creating a official VR video game. Rezzil are one of the new partners of the Premier League this year. Guinness are the other, who've taken over from Budweiser, king of beers, to become the official beer of the Premier League. Frankly, to be honest, like listing sponsors and the figures of how much they're paying can get a bit, well, isn't the most fascinating subject, shall we say. But there's a couple of interesting things, I think, to pick out from this. One is that the Premier League is clearly becoming itself a bigger brand. Manchester City actually interestingly noted this, I think, in one of their legal challenges. The Premier League is a competitor in the sponsorship space. And for some reason, that meant that Manchester City wasn't able to sign deals with someone. But I didn't completely understand the logical train of that argument. Maybe it makes sense to those more legally minded than I, especially when Manchester City ultimately get cut this income anyway. If we're putting the Premier League in the tier one echelon of global sports properties, which we rightly should, the main comparison here is the NFL. And the NFL does an incredible job of finding ways to bring in new partners and categories in a way that I don't think the Premier League ever could. I don't think it could get to that number. Simply, there's just not that level of inventory, and nor would the Premier League want to create it, where there is no need for a official pizza of the Premier League currently. I don't think. There is definitely more headroom, I think. So we're currently at 11 partners. I think there could be more. As I said, you can check out kind of all the details on these partners in our Premier League commercial guide. I guess on Guinness, this is a kind of change of direction for them as a brand. Traditionally been more associated with rugby. Any thoughts on the makeup of the official partner roster for the Premier League this year?
Yeah, you mentioned Guinness and the fee that's been doing the rounds there. It's about 10 million over 4 years. I think that's an uptick rather on the previous deal with Budweiser. I think was around the £8 million a year mark. So that's a win for the Premier League. I think beyond that, I've been quite interested in how they've sort of, on the gaming side, they've adjusted their licensing strategy, which sort of is reflective of the more diversified gaming landscape. So they've had, EA in as a partner, but they've added Football Manager and Rezzil, as you say, completely different consumers there. The video games are now one of the main ways younger fans can interact with football. So it makes sense that the Premier League is looking to have many different titles as partners to be able to kind of tap that audience. So it's not just football simulations, there's the management side of things, and then there's the Rezzil, which is going to create an official virtual reality video game. So it shows that the Premier League is being responsive to the sort of the balance of power shifting in a sense, so that rights holders and publishers, they're kind of no longer engaged in purely transactional relationships. The Premier League understands that reach and engagement is obviously very important. It can be more important than a minor increase in direct revenue, although obviously it's doing pretty well on that front. So I think that the way that it's expanding its licensing deals through the EA Sports Football Manager and Rezzil deals shows quite a lot of commercial acumen, given the sort of the changing nature of fan engagement, particularly when it comes to gaming.
I think it's a really good point, actually. I'm sure Stephen Casker would be chomping at the bit to tell us about how all of these different new digital touchpoints and gaming licenses are going to bring in new fans and eyeballs and stuff. It makes a lot of sense. So currently you've got, when you look at it, you've got EA, obviously, the EAFC, really featured in that. So Rare. Also Panini that's a kind of the more old school version of this, right? The trading cards. But yeah, Football Manager and Rezzil. So potentially you've got 4 different digital touch points there already. How far that goes, that'd be interesting to kind of keep a tab on. Where's the sort of the metaverse application in here? Is there a new world coming on Roblox, for example? That's potentially another area they could look to go into. But really astute to spot that, Ed, I think. While we're talking about the commercial guides, it's probably a really good time to highlight that listeners to the SportsPro podcast can get access to these commercial guides at a slightly reduced rate. That is if you sign up for a SportsPro Plus annual membership. That annual membership gives you access to all of the SportsPro Plus offering, which is not just limited to commercial guides, but includes our media hub, our video library, our exclusive features, deals trackers across the sort of broadcast and media sector, as well as our wire service. And as I said, listeners to the podcast can save money in doing so. That is if they use code podcast10 at checkout. That'll give you 10% off an annual subscription. That is code podcast10 at checkout. Terms and conditions very much apply. Right, Ed, we've been rambling on for a fair while now, but before I let you go back to your day job, we're going to do some predictions. So I ask you to come in with one off-field storyline prediction for the season. And the next, you're going to tell me how many Premier League clubs are going to be sold during the 2024-2025 campaign. Will the Premier League have a new CEO in 12 months' time? And who are going to be the biggest winners and biggest losers from this season? Do you want to start with off-field storyline?
Lord Panic, Manchester City's legal counsel will be the signing of the season. I think he's going to use every legal trick in the book there. Yeah, they'll be building a statue for him outside the Etihad, I reckon.
Yep. So how many clubs are going to be sold this season in the Premier League?
Other than Everton, possibly one or two more. Wolves, I think, potentially been sort of courting outside investment, but hasn't been anything particularly concrete recently. For now, I'm going to say just Everton. But we do this every year. We always overestimate, so I'm going to underestimate this year.
Manchester City are really the biggest challengers to this, but there's a growing feeling of discontent, I think, amongst the Premier League clubs in a way that's not really been there before. There was always the Big Six split and then the other 14. But this is obviously increasing pressure on CEO Richard Masters. Do you think that Mr. Masters will be still in tenure by the time we next do this podcast?
I'm going to say yes. I didn't realise he'd been at the league for as long as he had. He still weirdly sort of seems like quite a recent appointment when actually he's been in place since, I think it's December 2019. But I mean, if he does want to go, it's not a bad time to go. You've secured a new record domestic broadcast deal. You've got the regulator coming up. Do you really want to deal with that? As you say, you've got growing discontent from clubs. If he can get a satisfactory, if the Premier League deems the verdict on Manchester City to be satisfactory again, it'd be quite easy to walk away. I don't think he will go, aside from the fact actually finding a new Premier League CEO, as we saw the last time before he was appointed. He was effectively third choice because of what happened with the two previous hires. So these appointments, Premier League CEO, these things take time, and he probably does have an exit strategy, but I don't know if he's probably got a plan B through Z, but I don't think he'll be acting on that just yet.
And then finally, I need your answers on who is going to be the biggest winner and the biggest loser this season.
The St Mary's bar, when I go to games, the biggest losers, my heart rate could be a tough season.
So the St Mary's bar is going to be a big winner because you're going to spend all your money drowning your sorrows, essentially.
Yeah, spot on. With Premier League branded Guinness.
Okay. For what it's worth, my predictions, and we hold ourselves accountable every season to this, and never don't talk about them when it comes to the end. For me, I think with Ed having kind of nabbed Manchester City here, I think we're going to see good old profit and sustainability rear its beautiful head again throughout. There are various clubs that look like they're in trouble. Everton are definitely one of them, but I wouldn't be surprised if Aston Villa and Chelsea were also under further scrutiny for the way they've been spending. As we saw last year, what this kind of takes the form out of is kind of a movable feast. Is it double-digit points? Is it single-digit points? Who knows? It's going to be a hot topic, I think, throughout, until the Premier League really gets a handle on what they want to do about financial regulation and kind of what the aim is. I think Kieran Maguire puts that really well whenever you speak to him about it. It's like, what are the Premier League actually trying to achieve with this stuff? That, for me, I think will dominate. I did the maths, depending on which side of the Atlantic you're on how many clubs will be sold. So if John Textor wants to buy Everton, he has to sell Crystal Palace. So that's two clubs right there. And then other clubs that are on the market. So you mentioned Wolves. You didn't mention Brentford, who are also on the market. And given that I think that they are likely to be a Premier League club again next season, that could be one that also changes hands, which will delight Tony Bloom, Brighton owner, who has an ongoing beef with Matthew Benham, Brentford owner, which means that Tony Bloom never sits in the director's box at the G-Tech.
You Brighton fans, you'll do anything for a rivalry, won't you?
Oh, yeah. We're desperate. Really, really desperate. So, yeah, I think there'll be three. But then, as you said, we always overestimate this. Now, answering my own question on Richard Masters, I think he won't be there. That's my whole take for this season. I think all of those things that we've talked about, so Manchester City, growing discontent, PSR, FFP, whatever you want to call it, he's been obviously very good at doing the media stuff. That was his strength, even when he was working under Richard Scudamore. And so it's been no surprise, really, that he's managed those relationships well and secured a pretty decent deal. Yeah, the next person that comes in will have to be more of someone who can talk to the whole room.
Thomas Bach will be available.
Yeah, well, he'll talk to anyone loudly. He is available. This is true. Does he know anything about football? He may be a fencing expert, but I'm not sure he'd be able to kind of manage the increasing divide between the haves and the have-less of the Premier League. But I think Richard Masters will walk away and probably walk away with a fair bit of credit. Like you, Ed, I think he's done a fairly decent job, but there's just too much, I think, going on. And when you don't need the stress, why bother?
That's why we're not the Premier League chief executive, mate.
Yeah, that's why we're not the chief executive of anything. Right. And who do I think will be the biggest winner and the biggest loser this season? I think the biggest winner is going to be the club which is able to navigate the FFP regulations to the best of their ability, because ultimately they are going to be the ones that are set up. They can read the tea leaves, and they're going to be set up for success. I'm going to blow the horn of my own football club here, Brighton. They've managed this particularly well, and it means that we've been able to spend massively this summer and potentially really strengthen. Now, I don't think that's going to result in a Champions League or a cup run. Well, maybe a cup run, but I don't think it's going to result in a Champions League place. But I do think we're going to see a little uptick in performance there. I think really, actually, the team that are going to be the biggest winners this season are Newcastle. They look like they've kind of got themselves around these regulations. PIF have a firmer grip on that club now, with Amanda Staveley having sold up. And yeah, I think Newcastle will make a big run, kind of really setting themselves up for success. Everyone kind of thought Newcastle were going to come in and spend loads of money once they got bought out, and it's not really happened. And they've done it reasonably sensibly. And everyone's kind of forgotten the PIF are their owners, largely. Which human rights advocates, I guess, are sort of less happy about than maybe their fans. But I think Newcastle will be a big winner this season. Big losers, yeah, this one's tough. But I actually think Manchester City are going to be big losers this year. I think you sort of undersold the potential hit on not just their sort of on-field performance indicators, points, but also the other ramifications. I'm thinking transfer bans, big points deductions, and just a whole heap of uncertainty in the last contract year for Pep Guardiola, who's about to leave. So by the time we get to this next season, Manchester City are going to not be quite the juggernaut that they are right now. They'll still be a juggernaut. They'll still be a big club. And they'll probably still have a law case going on. But I see stormy times for Eastlands.
Going to be awkward when Guardiola signs a multi-year extension and they get offered a warning.
It's going to be even less awkward when he takes over as England manager and guides us to glory in World Cup 2026, lifting the trophy in New Jersey, bizarrely. But maybe I'm thinking with my heart rather than with my head.
Kind of what we've been doing for the last hour, really. It's organised chaos.
The SportsPro podcast is always organised chaos.
Heavy metal podcasting in the absence of Jurgen Klopp's football.
Yeah, Gengen podcasting. That's us. Right. Ed, thank you very much for your time and your opinions. I'm sure we'll be hearing from you again very soon.
Pleasure, mate. Speak to you soon.
Grand.